Snow came down over Montreal, not in soft flakes, but in sheets of white fury, blurring the skyline into a smear of gray steel and fading light. The storm pressed against the old stone of St. Albin's Cathedral, wrapping its Gothic spires in a suffocating shroud. Inside, the hush of organ notes stretched, heavy and slow, as the pews filled with mourners draped in black wool, lace gloves, and somber expressions. Their breath clouded in the cold nave, and the air smelled faintly of lilies, candle wax, and centuries of secrets. At the very front, framed by 100 white roses, stood a polished mahogany casket. Next to it, an enlarged photograph glowed under the flicker of votive candles. A woman in her 20s, auburn hair caught by sunlight, eyes bright with some private joy. Her name, etched in gold script on a placard, read Claraine Rousseau. The cathedral held its silence as her father, Pierre Rousseau, adjusted the pages of a prepared eulogy. His voice carried through the arches with practiced steadiness, every syllable measured like a ledger entry. He spoke of tragedy, of a daughter who had lost her way, of years of sorrow that had finally ended in a fatal accident far from home. He asked for prayers, for forgiveness, for closure. Beside him, his wife clutched a lace handkerchief, dabbing at eyes that glistened but never overflowed. Pearls gleamed against her throat as if grief itself had been staged as jewelry. Their son Julien, immaculate in his tailored suit, stood near them with the quiet poise of a man prepared to inherit not only sympathy, but something far greater. Cameras recorded the ceremony, and whispers passed through the crowd like a tide. Friends from childhood, neighbors from Quebec, professors from her university years, all bowed their heads in mourning for the woman whose photograph smiled above the casket. A life closed, a chapter sealed, a body buried. Except Claraine Rousseau was not dead. She was in Vancouver, 1,000 kilometers away, watching the entire spectacle unfold on the screen of her phone. Her fingers had gone numb when the message arrived that morning from an old neighbor, Mrs. Fournier, a woman she had not heard from in nearly a decade. No words of context, no hesitant attempt to reconnect, only a short note and a video attachment. The note had read simply, "I am so sorry about your passing. I cannot believe what I saw today." Claraine had pressed play with trembling hands, expecting a mistake. Instead, she saw her own funeral. The shock was not instant but creeping, as though every nerve in her body refused to believe what her eyes consumed. Her parents stood calm, unshaken, reading words that announced to the world that their eldest daughter was gone. Their voices did not tremble. Their faces did not crack. They were not broken by grief. They were executing a performance. And the audience believed every line. Her coffee had grown cold on the counter, untouched. The snow hammered against her apartment windows like fists demanding entry. But she could hear only the steady cadence of her father's voice, pronouncing her troubled, lost, and finally at peace. She replayed the video again and again, hoping for a glitch, a sign that it was fabricated. But the camera never lied. Her family had buried her alive in the eyes of the world. Why? The question throbbed in her skull like a drumbeat. Why erase her so completely? Why not silence her once and let her fade naturally into exile? Why a coffin, a service, a certificate of death? The answer lay in the years that had led to this moment. Years of betrayal carefully constructed into a narrative that painted her as the ruin. 3 years earlier, Claraine had been the responsible one, the daughter who kept the family accounts balanced while her younger brother Julien spent recklessly. He had drained nearly $80,000 from the trust their grandparents had established, gambling in underground poker games, financing champagne-soaked weekends in Montreal, leasing cars he could not afford. The numbers caught up with him, the books revealed the whole, and panic spread through the Rousseau household. Someone had to take the fall. Better one ruined child than two. Those had been her mother's exact words. Spat like venom in the narrow kitchen of the family estate. Her father had not met her eyes. He had simply signed the papers that made it official. Claraine was branded the thief, the failure, the shame. The next morning, her name was struck from bank accounts, her number blocked on every phone, her place at the table erased. Friends who had once trusted her disappeared overnight, their silence bought with whispers from her parents. She found herself isolated, stripped of every relationship that had anchored her. At 28, she packed her few belongings, boarded a plane to Vancouver, and learned to vanish. She rented a modest apartment near the harbor, worked in a cafe, later in a bookstore, and lived without noise. No social media, no public traces, no ties. She built her life on shadows, convinced that distance would numb the wound. But the silence from Montreal was not absence, it was burial. The first cracks appeared when her email refused to log in, flagged as belonging to a deceased user. Later, a bank clerk looked at her oddly when her account showed estate closed. The final blow came when a passport renewal was denied, the government system marking her as dead. Each incident confirmed a horrifying truth: her family had gone beyond disowning her. They had legally erased her. And now, as she stared at the video of her funeral, the proof was undeniable. They had declared her dead, staged the ceremony, and written her out of existence. The question was no longer if, but why. The answer arrived like a cold blade. Julien. Scrolling through social media one sleepless night, Claraine found his public posts gleaming with triumph. His wedding had been an affair of extravagance: white roses, chandeliers, champagne flowing like rivers. Among the guests were her parents, smiling with pride. At the reception, her father toasted his son as the true heir, the pride of the Rousseaus, while Claraine's absence was never acknowledged. She was not forgotten. She had been replaced. Further digging revealed the truth in ink and law. 6 months after her official death, the trust fund intended for her had been quietly transferred to Julien. The inheritance her grandparents left had vanished into his accounts, legitimized by a forged death certificate. Her erasure had been profitable. Claraine sat in the dim kitchen, her heart pounding, her breath shallow, as the fury hardened into something sharper than grief. They had not only stolen her name, they had weaponized her silence. And now, they would learn that silence could end. She began to gather evidence. Every lease, every employment record, every tax receipt, every immigration stamp became a weapon. She assembled her life on paper, building a dossier thicker than any family ledger, proof that she had lived, that she still lived, and that the story written in Montreal was a lie. She walked into a law office with the envelope clutched in her hand, the forged death certificate lying like poison at the top of the stack. The young attorney across from her blinked in disbelief as he turned page after page, the narrative of her stolen existence unfolding before him. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement. It was not merely betrayal, it was criminal. But Claraine was not content with legal resurrection alone. She needed something greater, something public, something that would pierce the polished mask her family wore in every cathedral and ballroom of Quebec. The opportunity came in the form of another message, anonymous this time, but precise. A memorial service was being planned for her anniversary at St. Albin's, the same church where her parents had first staged her death. The irony was unbearable. They would gather again, weep again, polish their false grief until it gleamed. And she would be there not as a ghost, not as a victim, but as a reckoning. Claraine stood at her apartment window, looking out over the glittering harbor of Vancouver, the city lights sparking like embers against the winter sky. She felt the old pain, the ache of abandonment, but beneath it burned something new, fierce, unstoppable. They had buried her once. Now she would rise. The return of the living, The morning of the memorial broke under a sky the color of iron. Montreal carried itself with the brittle quiet that comes before a storm, the kind of silence that gathers at the edges of the St. Lawrence and spreads into the veins of the city. The air was heavy with snow not yet fallen, the streets lined with salted grit and dark sedans. St. Albin's Cathedral loomed against the slate horizon, its doors open just wide enough to swallow the endless trickle of mourners who came dressed in black. Inside, the nave glowed with candlelight, shadows pooling between the arches, organ notes unfurled like slow waves, filling the vaults with sorrow that had been rehearsed long before. Ushers guided guests to pews where white programs had been laid out in neat stacks. At the front, the portrait of Claraine Rousseau stood again, the same photograph that had been chosen for her death, smiling with a radiance that mocked the gloom of the room. The casket beneath it was polished, reflecting the tremor of flames, its emptiness disguised by flowers. The pews swelled with faces both familiar and distant, relatives from Quebec City, neighbors from Laval, business associates of her father, professors from McGill who remembered her name only from the honor rolls. They filled the air with whispers, with the kind of grief that lives in performance, as though each bowed head were part of a tableau curated for the prestige of sorrow. The Rousseau family sat at the front, as they always had, arranged like royalty in mourning. The priest spoke of absence and memory, of the tragedy of a life cut short, of lessons learned in mourning. His voice wound through the aisles, wrapping the crowd in ritual. At the moment of silence, the cathedral stilled as though the building itself held its breath. Candles flickered, organ notes hushed, and hundreds of heads bowed in unison. That was the moment the doors opened. They did not swing wide but groaned, ancient wood giving way to pressure, the sound cutting into the silence like a blade. A gust of cold air rushed down the aisle, scattering candle flames. Light from the winter morning poured in, harsh and unfiltered, slicing through the dim nave. Footsteps struck the marble, sharp, deliberate, echoing with a rhythm that did not belong to grief but to judgment. Gasps spread in ripples. A murmur began at the back, disbelief blooming into whispers. Faces turned, eyes widened, hands froze mid-prayer. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, asking questions in voices too small to carry. Yet the words pierced the silence. Wasn't she supposed to be gone? Claraine Rousseau stepped into the aisle as if walking out of her own grave. Her black coat clung to her frame, her hair pulled back, her eyes hidden by dark glasses. Each step forward was deliberate, each strike of her heel against stone an indictment. The crowd recoiled, some shrinking into pews, others craning forward to see whether what they witnessed was flesh or ghost. At the front, her mother's face blanched, handkerchief falling to the floor. Her father's jaw slackened, the script in his hand slipping free like sand. Julien's composure cracked, his lips tightening, his eyes locking on the figure advancing with unyielding purpose. The portrait above the casket smiled down, as though mocking them all. Claraine moved until she stood at the foot of the chancel, directly beneath the photograph chosen to represent her absence. She turned to face the congregation, lifting her chin. The hush was absolute, the weight of disbelief pressing the room into stillness. Slowly, with hands steady, she reached into her coat and withdrew a folder, thick with documents, its edges worn by weeks of preparation. She held it as one would hold both a shield and a weapon. The silence broke not with words, but with presence. She did not need to speak yet. The fact of her body standing alive before them was testimony enough. The audience shifted, torn between fear and fascination, their eyes darting from the casket to the woman, from the portrait to the living reality. Some raised phones instinctively, the tiny red dots of cameras glowing like embers in the dark. She opened the folder with a motion slow enough to be deliberate. Pages gleamed with official seals, signatures, stamps, passport entries charted years of travel, Employment contracts bore her name. Tax records lined with numbers confirmed her existence, hospital files, rental agreements, immigration stamps, all the mundane proofs of life assembled into a weapon against the architecture of lies. One by one, she lifted them into view, the evidence glinting under the stained glass light. The priest's face drained of color. The ushers froze, and the crowd murmured in disbelief. The narrative they had accepted crumbled before their eyes. The Rousseau parents sat frozen, their performance of grief unraveling. Their daughter had returned not as a prodigal child seeking forgiveness, but as a reckoning draped in flesh and fact. The lie was exposed, not in whispers but in front of every witness they had invited to their stage. Julian's hands clenched on his lap, knuckles white, as the inheritance he had claimed without guilt began to slip through his grasp. He had stood for years in the shadow of her erasure, thriving on the wealth redirected in her absence. But now the absence stood before him, undeniable, alive, unbroken. The silence cracked into noise. Gasps rose into voices, voices into questions, questions into a storm of disbelief. Phones recorded, flashes sparked, the crowd shifted in waves. The memorial had collapsed into chaos, the funeral transfigured into a trial. Claraine turned her gaze slowly across the sea of faces, from neighbors who had abandoned her to relatives who had believed the lie, to professors who had erased her from their rosters, to family friends who had nodded solemnly at her supposed tragedy. Each pair of eyes she met flinched, as if her presence were a mirror reflecting their complicity. Then she turned her eyes to her parents. Her mother's hands trembled in her lap, pearls twisting against her throat. Her father stared, pale and hollow, the authority of his voice shattered. Their power had always lived in narrative, in their ability to control stories, to sculpt truth. But truth had risen in flesh and now stood against them. Claraine closed the folder with a snap that echoed louder than the organ ever had. She placed it on the pulpit, directly on top of the papers her father had been using to read her eulogy. The sound reverberated like a gavel striking wood. The crowd knew what it meant. This was no ghost, no fabrication, no dream. This was reality correcting itself with brutal clarity. The priest stammered, his liturgy lost. The ushers glanced at one another, unsure whether to approach or retreat. The congregation erupted into whispers, some horrified, others exhilarated. Cameras captured every second, streaming it beyond the cathedral walls, carrying it into homes, newsrooms, offices. The world beyond Montreal would know that Claraine Rousseau, declared dead, buried in lies, had walked into her own memorial to reveal the truth. The organ did not play again. The silence that followed was not reverence but collapse. The collapse of a story too carefully built, too greedily held, too arrogantly believed. Claraine turned, her footsteps echoing once more against the marble as she walked back down the aisle. The crowd parted like water, uncertain whether to reach for her or recoil. At the door, she paused. The bells above began to toll, heavy, deliberate, their sound spilling across the city. They had been meant to mourn her absence. Now they announced her return. She stepped into the snow, the cold striking her lungs with clarity sharper than rage. Outside, cameras followed, questions shouted, microphones thrust. But Claraine did not stop. She moved through the storm, the city bending around her, each flake of snow melting against the fire that burned inside her chest. The battle was no longer about survival. It was about reclamation. Her identity. Her inheritance. Her truth, all of it would be restored. The performance inside St. Albin's had ended. The real reckoning was only beginning. Resurrection in law, burial in truth. The storm that had broken over Montreal the day of the memorial did not end with snow. It lingered in the veins of the city, in headlines and whispers, in the static hum of television screens replaying the moment over and over. The image of Claraine Rousseau walking into her own funeral spread like wildfire, carried through the digital arteries of the world, shared with gasps and disbelief. By evening, her name was on the lips of strangers who had never known her in life, but now knew her as the woman who had risen from her own grave. The footage traveled faster than fire, each frame dissected by journalists, each detail magnified by the public hunger for scandal. The papers in her hands, the look on her parents' faces, the frozen composure of her brother all captured, replayed, slowed to reveal the anatomy of deceit. The narrative that her family had crafted for years collapsed in a single hour, its ashes carried across borders and screens. While the world consumed the spectacle, Claraine returned to Vancouver with a silence sharper than steel. She did not need to speak. The images had spoken for her. Instead, she returned to her desk, stacked the folder of evidence once more, and began the process of law. The first filing went to the provincial court, a petition to vacate the death certificate. Stamped, sealed, submitted. It marked the legal resurrection of her name. The process was clinical, bureaucratic, devoid of the drama of the cathedral. But it was the foundation on which everything else would stand. Each form carried the weight of her persistence, each affidavit sworn with the clarity of someone who had been buried alive and clawed her way back. The next filing was heavier, a complaint of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The targets were clear: Pierre and Marguerite Rousseau, and Julienne Rousseau, beneficiaries of her legal erasure. Attached were pages of bank transfers, trust documents, and property deeds, each stamped with dates that aligned too neatly with the day she had been declared dead. It was not only betrayal, it was theft of the highest order, and the law would not ignore it. News outlets followed the filings like hounds on a trail. Cameras lingered outside courthouses. Reporters spoke in urgent tones of betrayal within one of Quebec's most prominent families. The Rousseaus had built their reputation on legacy, on respectability, on the illusion of integrity. Now their name was being dragged through the courts, each headline cutting deeper into the empire they had tried to protect by sacrificing their eldest daughter. Claraine watched from a distance. Her presence felt more in absence than in speech. She did not attend every hearing, did not grant interviews. She let the silence build around her, let the image of her walking into St. Albin's carry the story forward. The world had already seen enough to know the truth: she was alive, and her family had killed her in name to profit from her absence. Investigations dug deeper. Government agencies combed through the records, tracing signatures, verifying dates. The death certificate was found to have been filed with forged hospital records and a falsified police report of an overseas car crash. No accident had ever occurred. The forgeries were crude, held together only by the Rousseau name and the willingness of officials to accept what seemed inevitable. Under scrutiny, they crumbled. The trust fund transfers revealed their own trail of greed. Assets moved into Julienne's name within weeks of the certificate, property titles reassigned, investments liquidated. It was as if the family had waited only long enough for her body to grow cold, except there had been no body. The documents spoke with a clarity no tears could obscure. The scandal consumed them. Business partners withdrew. Charitable boards requested resignations. Invitations ceased. The empire that had once stood untouchable began to crack, the foundations hollowed by lies. Marguerite withdrew from public life. Shutters closed on the estate. Pierre appeared in court with his face ashen, stripped of the authority he once commanded with ease. Julienne, once groomed as heir, now moved like a man pursued, his name a byword for fraud. Claraine, meanwhile, moved through the process with steady hands. Each affidavit signed was a brick in her reconstruction. Each hearing attended was a nail in the coffin of the narrative that had sought to erase her. She became both plaintiff and proof, her body the living contradiction of the lies written against her. The ruling came months later, but its echo would last for years. The court declared the death certificate null and void, reinstating her legal identity in full. It ordered restitution of the trust, the return of assets wrongfully transferred, and the opening of a criminal inquiry into the forgeries. The judgment was more than victory. It was resurrection, the law itself proclaiming her alive where once it had recorded her dead. The news broke across the country. The headlines fierce the woman who sued her own death and won. For many, she became a symbol not only of betrayal and survival, but of the stubborn endurance of truth. Her story was told in editorials, documentaries, whispered in classrooms and courtrooms alike. She had become more than herself. She was the ghost who refused to stay buried, the daughter who had turned her family's stage into their judgment. Yet for Claraine, it was not fame that mattered. It was freedom. For years she had lived as a shadow, erased, forgotten, existing only in the quiet margins of Vancouver's streets. Now she could breathe without the weight of false absence, walk into a bank without being treated as an estate, hold a passport that confirmed she was flesh and blood. The smallest victories tasted sweetest, the right to sign her name, to exist in records, to claim the life that had been stolen. Her family paid their price. Pierre and Marguerite lived the rest of their days under the shadow of disgrace. Their names no longer doors to prestige but to suspicion. Julien faced charges that stripped him of his inheritance, his marriage unraveling under the weight of scandal. The empire they had fought to protect by burying her alive crumbled into dust. Claraine did not watch with vengeance, but with clarity. She did not need to raise her voice or strike in anger. The truth had done the work for her. They had written her obituary with lies, and she had turned it into their epitaph. In the quiet evenings of Vancouver, she would sometimes stand at her window, watching the harbor lights flicker across the dark water. She thought of the cathedral, of the moment the doors opened and light cut through the nave, of the silence that followed her steps down the aisle. It had been the most terrifying and liberating moment of her life, the instant when she chose to return not as victim but as verdict. The bells of St. Albin's had tolled for her once, mourning a death that had never occurred. But in her memory, they no longer rang as funeral bells. They rang as the sound of resurrection, of a life reclaimed, of truth breaking stone. Sometimes, she whispered to herself, not in anger, but in steady acknowledgement. Sometimes you have to die in their world to be reborn in your own. And she had been reborn, not into the family that betrayed her, but into the freedom that came from no longer needing them. She carried no desire for reconciliation, no hunger for forgiveness. Her return had not been for them, it had been for herself. In the end, the greatest revenge was not in the ruin of their empire. Though that had come, it was in her survival, her persistence, her refusal to vanish. They had buried her with lies, and she had risen with truth. The world would remember the woman who walked into her own funeral, but Claraine Rousseau would remember something deeper, that the grave they built for her had become their own.